Hello, today we are going to implement Redux in ReactJS application with Typescript. So our end result of the application will look similar to this, where in the left panel we are showing the list of users and on the right panel the posts related to the users. It's a very simple application. We are just going to the concept how we can use Redux toolkit in a React application. So we are going to follow this Redux toolkit documentation for that. And when we click on get started, we can see what are the steps required. So we'll follow this step one by one, and we are going to build it using Typescript. So let's start. So it's installed now. Let's move within the folder Redux Toolkit demo. And now what we need to do, we need to install these two packages. So let's paste it here, and at the same time we can use React Redux. We also need to install type React Redux at the types React Redux. Open this in Visual Studio Code and let's go to index.tsx within the app and remove everything that we have till now. We are not going to define much into the CSS, but just to give a look and feel, we are going to implement some basic CSS in the application. So this will look similar to something like this. Let's create a folder, store, and then we can add a new file, index.ts. This file will act as a store for our application. So let's import. Now we have this import configure store, and we can just copy paste it here, and let's define our store here. Const store is equal to configure store and reducer. For now we are going to keep it as empty. So we have completed this step. Now we need export type root state and export type app dispatch. Handy in future whenever we are going to define the type of the dispatch, we are going to use it as the app dispatch. And wherever we are going to define our root state of the application, we are going to define it as a root state. It could be named as app state or anything, but root state is what's in the documentation, so we are going with that. Now these are totally two optional steps, so we are going to leave it for now. But when we are going to use dispatch, we'll come back to this step again. Is export default store, and our store is ready. Let's go with the index.tsx file where we have app is being called. Now we are just going to wrap it inside the provider store. We can import our store as store. Now we have a storage defined. If we try to run this application at this point, so nothing is displaying right now because we haven't done anything. And let's stop this here. Create a new folder, reducers. Create an index file. Go to the documentation and we can see how reducers is created. So it's a very simple step. We can go to the documentation and we can see we just need to import combined reducers. const root reducers. You can name it whatever you want. Combine reducers. We'll come to this part later again and export default root reducers. This root reducer will be imported in our store. Here, let's put some values in the root reducers. For that, we are going to define a users module. Let's get a new file index.tsx. This has a left panel and this one has a right panel. So in left panel, this whole page will be act as a panel container. So create two divs, right panel. Now we are going to define a reducer for the users. You can also put it inside this reducers folder, but I like the way it is to place all the user status stuff in users folder, either it's selectors, reducers, whatever it is. We are creating user reducers. Let's get a type first for interface. This also will define what will the value, what will be the type of the initial state of the users reducer. Define initial state as I users reducers, whose value will be users of empty array and loading is false. Now we are going to define slice according to this. Users slice, create slice. We can import create slice from redux-js toolkit. Initial state, and reducers will create now. So, and we can define export const curly braces is equal to user slash dot actions and export default user slash dot reducer. We are directly exporting the reducer here so that we won't have to write dot reducers in the root reducers file. So now going to the store reducer part again. Let's say its name is user info user reducers. Okay. So we have user reducers from users.reducers. Now we are going to create actions. The first action will be to set users action. So the first parameter will be a state, but action will be payload action. If we import payload action of type user model array. Now we can import payload action from redux-js toolkit and we can simply return state, let's say users colon action dot payload. Now our type of the payload is user model array, which is similar to user, so it will be a simple one-liner code. Now the next action that we are going to create is for the reset action, reset users action. I'm following the naming convention of action in our action name because it will be easier to identify that it is an action, and we can simply return as, and we can put it inside here, reset user actions. So our users reducer is completed, almost completed. Now we are going to call this actions in our users component. JSON placeholder, and for users we can use this API. So let's create a use effect, and instead of returning JSON, let's import use effect from React. We are going to, on load of the page, we are going to reset. So const dispatch is equal to use dispatch, and here dispatch. Now we have created one action as reset users action. It's a Typescript, so is crying about making the dispatches dependency. And here we can use dispatch set users action as, we can name it from JSON to users, and here users. So there are two things. We can create reducers here, or we can create a folder, separate folder for selectors and use theirs. So we'll create a new file with the same folder and name it users.selectors.ts, and get users, and we need to pass state dot users. Copy this value and copy, we are going to use const users list use selector get user selector, and that's it. Let's console it somewhere and see if we are able to get the value in our users list or not. Now we have the list is coming. If we go to the documentation, if earlier we have skipped one part of use app dispatch and use app selector. So we have two things, use app dispatch and use app selector. We can copy it, paste it on a store, going to import all the dependencies, and instead of in our application using use dispatch, we can use app dispatch. It's the same thing. Similarly for use app selector, and we can remove this use app and use dispatch. Let's only print h1 at that time and put it user dot let's say name. If we import user model, now we have key as id. Let's see. So we get the name for all the users. Let's get another folder user. The, let's call this user component from using whatever we are using instead of h1, and we can pass user. We haven't exported its default value. That's why it was not importing. So if you see, so our user list is now ready. Let's put some class, and the output is a bit much nicer than the previous one. Let's refresh it. Now we are going to implement the selected value, each name on the user. What we are going to do, we are going to display its post. For that, we are going to API posts. This contains all the posts of the user, but if we filter it like user ID is equal to, let's say, 2, then it will only show the post related to the user ID, user with having ID 2. So we are going to call that API once we are click on this. So in order to do that, we need to store the selected value in the Redux, and then it will highlight the selected user. In the user reducer, let's say selected user of type user model or null. Selected user of type null. Now we have created one set selected user action. So what we are going to do, on each click we are going to set the selected user in the Redux. So we are going to put on click on div for now, just for the tutorial purpose. So we have defined set selected user action, but we haven't exported it. So let's export it here. From user.reducer, and we can pass it as user. We can on click here. Now we can create a selector for that as well. If the user is currently selected one, we are going to apply some CSS. Let's see what is happening. So on refresh, nothing is selected, but on click, it's getting selected and getting highlighted as well. Let's see what is the effect on the redux-dev toolkit. Reset everything, refresh it. Now we have, whenever this application loads, and API calls and dispatches the action, set user actions, and we can see user info is set to 10%. Now when we click on this one, any user selected user action is getting fired. Now this users is the name that we defined inside the reducer. So if we put it like 1 to 3 and save it, now when we click on this one, we see users 1 to 3 is getting fired instead of user. So the name get appended with the action name to create a type of the dispatch. Let's remove 1 to 3 for now. Now we are going to solve one more problem. When the user loads, the default is nothing. So let's set on load, on API load, set default selection to first item. For that we are going to call use effect, and then we are going to put a simple condition. If users is defined, user list is length greater than 0, then we are going to just dispatch as set selected user action as users list of 0. So users list length is greater than 0 and there is no selected user. So whenever the application loads, we are going to set the default list to user. So now whenever we refresh the page, is reset its default value to selected users to 0. And now what we have done, we have created this inside the use effect. Now suppose you don't want to use the fetch or your API call within this file, but you want to make it a separate file. Let's say in the API file, we can just cut it from here and return it here. Now the issue is we don't have dispatch in our API file. So there are two ways to resolve this. First, what we can do, we can just pass the dispatch, and we have created already the type of dispatch in our store file as app dispatch, so there won't be any issue. And when we going to call this function, the function name that is get users, we can import here, import app dispatch and import our action. Okay, now this get users, we can call this from here, and we can pass the reference to our dispatch from this function. Dispatch is defined using the use app dispatch, and we are just going to pass the dispatch in our API file. Now if you see, the result is same, but the better approach would be, suppose we have another API, what we can do, we can make get users list. Instead of passing dispatch, we can simply return users, or just to put in one line, users. Now here get users list dot, then, and now here we can call our dispatch set users actions and users. This is another way to go. And if you see, the output remains the same. You are not go, suppose you don't want to call then, and you just want to call the dispatch, and you don't want to define your actions and everything, it's get clutter. So what we are going to do next, we are going to define one dispatcher file which calls all the dispatch in one function, which is going to call all the API file. We are going to put try catch and everything. So let's get another file, users dot dispatchers dot ts. This is going to contain all our dispatchers. Suppose there are 10 dispatchers in one file, so we don't have to rewrite the same API call again and again. So what we are going to do, we are going to define a separate file for that, and going to put our API call definitions here. Get users list, return dispatch. Now we are going to create one more action in our reducer to set this loading value to true. This is the type that is going to be contained by action.payload. So payload action is basically what will be the type of the action payload, action.payload. So in this case, set loading action, we are going to pass as boolean. So copy this, and from the dispatchers, let's put it inside the try catch. Set loading action to true. That means we are going to call our API. Not this one, because we haven't exported it. Let's export it here, and now we can import. Set users action, users list. Now we can call this from here, dispatch, and we can just remove this, and we can remove our API calls as well. If we're going to reload our application, this is going to be the same. So let's create the card component, the card that will display the post of each selected user. Now post, and let's create a card. This is going to a very simple card, and I'm not going into much more details for this, but this just contain a card container, and just render post.id, title and body, and some CSS for the card. And now we have defined our card component. Let's define the post component so that whenever we click on the left side of the user, we can render the post for the particular user. So let's define a reducer. In the same reducer, you can define, or you can define in a different reducer. And this will contain post array, be false, and here a simple array. This is going to be the same code that we have used for set loading action. This is set post loading. Is simply setting as the true action.payload, whatever we are passing, true or false. And set post is similar to set user action. Simply user model, instead of user model, we are using the post. Now we can export this to set post and set post loading. We are going to create another use effect to call post for each selected user. We can simply dispatch. We haven't created the dispatch for this selected user yet. So we can go to this file dispatchers and we can create our dispatch get posts. We can just call. Again, we need to define in our API. Now we have get post available with me. So set post loading true. Get users. Get posts simply, and we can pass our user ID to the get post API, which we have been calling from dispatch get post, and set post loading to simply we can put it as posts. I just copy pasted above dispatch, so we need to modify this. And again, we need to call this as false, because once it's true, here it is false, but in case of error, we also need to do the same. Now we have dispatched get post. We can simply go to our index.tsx and selected user dot id. This time we don't need question mark, because we have already if condition there, which checks that it must be true or the selected user is available. But again, we need to put dispatch as the dependency because Typescript asks for it. And whenever we click on the user, this API call that is going to call that post API. Now we are going to use selectors. And for the same, if his post is loading, then we can do this. What I have done here, I have simply checked if his post is loading, then we are going to show the loading message. And if the post is not loading, then we are checking if user post is available. Then we are going to render it in the card. We are going to implement some CSS here so that it looks a bit nicer. Now the application is visible as it is. So let's get one class component and name this as user list. User list. This is going to be our class component. So from here You can also write this as state dot user info dot loading. So the selector is doing the same thing just inside a function, and you can always write it something like this. Now user list is here. Let's say we are going to again map dispatch to props, and we can simply call this. Now we have two functions, reset user actions and dispatch get users. It mapped dispatch to props, and we have map state to props for user list. We can define our type, export type I user. We can define our props here, map dispatch to props user list. We can import connect using React Redux and user list. This should be in public render. We can define public component mount, and on mount we can call props dot dispatch get user list. Remove this div completely. We just want to show user list, so we can destructure this dot props and just replace everything. Import user model and user component. Now what we are going to do, we are going to call this user list where we are calling our users within the app. Users list. Now this list is based on the class component directly, and if we now run our application, we can see the list is being displayed. We are not implementing any CSS, so there is no difference if we are using the class component or the functional component. We can call our redux toolkit implementation.